Can you hear that? Can you hear the sounds of birds all around? You know, one of my favorite things about this space behind the church where all these really tall trees grow is not just the size of the tree line, but the fact that these giant trees make space for birds to live in. And for that matter, the prairie meadow doesn't just have lovely flowers, but it creates a space for pollinators, for bees, that they can pollinate the plants and they can then take care of their hive. There's this sense of things that aren't just big for their own sake, but whose size and whose growth allows other things to thrive and to flourish. You know, it's interesting, Jesus uses a set of images like that to describe how God's reign works. There's a couple of stories we're going to hear this coming Sunday where Jesus throws out a bunch of quick, short, small vignettes as parables. The reign of God, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that's really tiny, then grows so big it becomes this big shrub, big enough that birds can come make their nests in. He says it's like a measure of yeast that's worked into the dough, and now you've got this big batch of dough that's all leavened and becomes this big loaf of bread from just a small amount of yeast or leavening. Those images suggest that God's reign isn't just something that starts small and gets bigger, although that's true, right? It starts with Jesus and a handful of former fishermen and tax collectors and becomes this worldwide movement, you might say. But more than that, Jesus says God's reign isn't just big for the sake of being big, and size isn't just the only criterion, but rather God's reign grows for the sake of including, enfolding, and caring for others beyond its own boundaries. That's something really important for us to think about if whatever it is that we call church has something to do with the kingdom of God. Maybe they're not identical, right? The reign of God is always bigger than your church or my church or the church. But it does at least say even the goal of being church, the point of being church, isn't just to be bigger for the sake of being bigger. But growth is always for the sake of how do we help create space for others? How do we help give ourselves away for the sake of others, right? The yeast makes the whole batch of dough better and more like what it's supposed to be. The tree, the shrub, the mustard plant grows big enough so that even the birds can come make nests in its branches. There's this sense that to be a part of God's movement isn't just to go from small to big, but in that growth to be able to create space, to create life, to create a sanctuary for others who are vulnerable and in need of shelter, for the good of something bigger than ourselves. If all we are as church is just a social club looking to get bigger and bigger, I'm not really sure that this is the thing worth spending our time on. There are plenty of social organizations that get bigger and bigger. There's plenty of clubs out there, activities, hobbies that get popular. Maybe the goal of being church isn't just how do we get more people, but rather how does God create growth in us that then makes space for others, that does good for the wider world around us, that becomes a reflection of God's own character in the world. That's worth giving everything to. That's worth spending our lives on, which also then makes sense of the other interesting parables we get this coming week, where Jesus says the kingdom of God, the reign of God is like finding a treasure in a field, and you know about it, you found it, and you would then sell all your possessions to go buy that field so you could have that treasure. It's worth everything else that you might give up. It's like finding a pearl of great value and deciding this is worth spending all your money on so you can have this one great pearl. There's that sense that whatever it is Jesus has come to bring is worth giving our whole lives, our whole selves to. Not just in a sense of after I die I'll get to go somewhere nice, but that in this life as well, we get to be a part of something amazing, deeply good, where God is present. That's the invitation we're brought into. The living God has invited us into a new way of living in the world that, continues beyond death into life, beyond the grip of death. But even now, we are part of this community, this growing community that grows like a mustard plant, that grows like yeast in the bread dough to make the whole thing get bigger, but also exists for the sake of those who don't yet belong to it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once famously said, "The church is the only organization on earth that exists for the well-being of those who don't yet belong to it." There's something important about that, right? That we're not just a club here to look out for fellow club members. We exist for the sake of the world, because that's how God's love works, right? Because Jesus has come for the sake of the world. And so here we are as well. What could it look like in your life and my life to find ourselves more fully alive, because we're part of this reign of God that's happening here and now, growing right under our noses, getting tall as pine trees in the distance and making space for sparrows and cardinals? Consider that as you join us this coming Sunday. See you then.